Continuing our online learning training series and covering our philosophy of foundational training. Now, this video is going to be the most
important video and educational tool in this entire series. It is what we're going to be using every day for the dog's life, and that is marker training. Now, marker training is just a new age way of saying classical conditioning. Now, if you are used to clicker training, then this makes sense to you. If you have gone to a simple basic psychology class in high school or college, then this should start ringing a bell. If not, I'll continue and kind of explain what classical conditioning is. There was a scientist back in the day called Ivan Pavlov that had learned that ringing a bell can create a significant response in a dog by pairing it with feeding. What he learned is he could take a bell, ring it. The dog would show no interest whatsoever. Then he would pair it with the feed time. He would ring the bell, then feed the dog. Ring the bell, then feed the dog. Through consistency and repetition, he learned that the dogs would pair that ringing of the bell with that food and start salivating, whether or not the food was in front of him. So he bridged the same reaction from the feed time to the bell. And this is all done through one of our golden rules, which is consistency. If we are consistent with our marker training, the dog will have a clear-cut, black and white snapshot picture of what is to be expected, and it will make training so much easier. Now, in everyday training, we have 4 markers, and we have 2 that we use for work and sports, but I'll save for the end. But the first one we'll start working is the yes marker. Then we'll move to the nuh-uh, and then the good, and finally the no. So here are 4 everyday markers. Yes, good, nuh-uh, and no. I prefer to use nuh-uh. Some people use nope, but I don't like to use nope because nope sounds too much like no, and that could confuse the dog, create inconsistencies, and be unfair to the dog. So I want to use clear markers that the dog can understand through repetition. The first marker is yes. Yes is going to be our positive reinforcer. I will say yes and reward the dog over and over and over again until the dog understands that yes means it's going to receive a reward. Now, every time that I say yes, I will reward that dog. I want that dog to understand that every time I say yes, it did what is right and it did what is expected and it will receive that reward. To properly reinforce a behavior, we have to reward the dog within a second of it doing the behavior. Now, if I say sit and the dog sits, it's going to be real hard for me to put a treat in the dog's mouth within a second, especially if there's any distance between us. But if I can put that on cue, whether it be a clicker, an e-collar beep, or in this case, a verbal cue such as yes, the dog will now know immediately it's going to receive a reward, therefore it has been reinforced. So yes is our positive reinforcement marker. It is also my release cue for that command. If I say sit and the dog sits and I say yes, that means you're no longer expected to keep sitting. Here is your reward. The next marker we will use in training is the nuh-uh. The nuh-uh is a try again marker. This is our negative punishment as well. We are going to withhold the reward from the dog because it didn't listen. And we will simply say nuh-uh and let the dog try again. This will create fairness with the dog. The dog will learn to respect us because of this. Because the dog is learning, it doesn't fully understand what is expected. It is unfair for me to correct the dog for this. So I will use negative punishment by saying nuh-uh, which teaches the dog to try again. So I say sit, the dog sits, I say yes. I say sit, the dog doesn't sit, I simply say nuh-uh, and then let the dog try again. Nuh-uh does not receive a reward and it does not receive a correction. Keep in mind it simply means try again. Next, I use good. Now that the dog understands what a sit command is, I want it to learn to sit until released. So good is our duration marker. It is our continuation marker. Now, the first few times you use good, expect the dog to break.
Because up to this point, every time the dog is sat, you gave it a yes, which is a release, so it's going to anticipate you saying yes. So when you say good the first couple times, expect it to be a little confused and jump up. Just stay consistent with saying nuh-uh, and then try again, and then say good. The dog will learn that good means you're doing the right thing, keep doing it. Good does not receive a reward, and it does not receive a correction. It simply means keep going, you're doing good. Finally, that leads to no. No means you are getting corrected every time. It is our positive punisher. It is the yin to the yes is yang. Just like yes receives a reward every time, no receives a correction every time. This means you messed up, here's a correction, let's do it again. Just like yes can create a chemical reaction in the brain by enough pairings with a reward, no can do the same chemical reaction if paired with a correction every time. That way in training, eventually we can say no, and the dog will still physically react as if we gave it a physical correction, whether or not we did. But these are the 4 important quadrants of training that coincide with operant conditioning. Now, yes, I will start in our pre-learning phase. Remember that this is the fun phase. This is the playful phase. What I will do with a new dog or a puppy, I will take its daily feedings and I will put it in a bowl and I will sit with the dog and feed it piece by piece while saying yes. I'll say yes, then feed. Yes, then feed. Yes, then feed. Through consistency and repetition, the dog will learn over a few days or even a week that every time I say yes, it is going to receive some kibble or a treat or some kind of food. Eventually this will become a tug or another type of reward, but in the beginning phases, it's always going to be food. What I'm looking for in the beginning pre-learning phase is whenever I say yes, the dog snaps its head and looks at me, gets overly excited, and shows me that it understands it's going to get a reward. Once it's showing these signs, we'll move into the learning phase. The learning phase means luring. There's no verbal markers, there's no verbal cues. I'm simply luring the dog into physical positions such as sits, downs, stands, heels, things like that, by simply making it follow the treat. Once it gives me the behavior I'm looking for, then I simply say yes and I feed it. Eventually the dog will start understanding, hey, every time I sit, I get a reward. Every time I down, I get a reward. Every time I get into heel position, I get a reward. This is also the phase we start saying nuh-uh. If the dog, turns away from us, we'll say nuh-uh. When the dog looks as what? Then we can say yes and start rewarding the dog for looking at us. So the learning phase, I'll have another video to really show the different things that we do here. But just understand that learning phase is our luring phase, and this is where we create muscle memory. And we simply use yes and nuh-uh only in the learning phase. We simply want the dog to understand through physical body motions what is expected. Now I will do this over and over again until I see the dog offering the behaviors. Through consistency and repetition and training, every time the dog sits, down, stands, or gets in the heel position, it usually gets the yes marker. I will start looking for the dog to freely offer these behaviors. I will stand there like a statue and watch the dog. Then I see the dog sit. It doesn't get a yes, it'll lay down. It doesn't get a yes, it'll stand. It still doesn't get a yes, it'll move into a heel position. This is the dog showing me that it is now working for the reward, not because of it. Now that the dog has shown me that it understands what is expected, we can move into the understanding phase. And that is where we start incorporating the good marker. The understanding phase is also the phase we start utilizing the luring hand positions into hand signals. Like I said previously, a dog is a very visual learning creature. They learn through body language. They learn so much faster through hand signals than they do with verbal cues a lot of the time. So what I like to do is I will start luring the dog in a certain way that my hands are in certain positions that can be bridged to hand signals. And in the understanding phase, I will slowly start using solely those hand signals and start incorporating the good marker. Now the dog, I give the hand signal for sit. The dog sit, I say good. The dog learns that hand signal means sit, and it must keep sitting to receive the release and the reward. Now that I can get the dog to sit, down, stand, and get into heel by simple hand motions, and can do them for durational times, then I'll start moving towards the conditioning phase. Now the conditioning phase ties into the don't name it until you like it. Now that the dog is sitting the way I want it to sit solely through hand signals, it's downing the way I want it to down by using hand signals, I will start putting these on verbal cues. What I will do at this point is I will say sit, then give a hand signal. If the dog sits, I can say yes and release it, or I can say good and continue that. If it doesn't, I can say nuh-uh and try again. Once the dog is doing this for duration time with hand signals, I will start putting it on that verbal cue, so whenever through repetition and continuing this, I will say sit, the dog anticipates the hand signal and it will sit. And now the dog hears the yes, and it'll say, oh wow, I'm getting the reward, and he didn't even have to move his hand that time. Now I've effectively taught my dog to sit with hand signals and verbal cues. Now that the dog is doing verbal and physical cues, I will start correcting them for disobeying. Now keep in mind, we've done this training for weeks and months. It's time that the dog understands responsibility. It understands accountability, that it must obey every time. I'm going to give that verbal command one time, and I expect that dog to perform 100%. Now, I said there was 4 markers that we use in everyday training. There's 2 others that I like to use for working dogs or sport dogs. The first one is a ready marker. This is what I use before we start work. If I am using a dog for sport, I say ready before we start our routine. I'll release the dog from the crate, and before we get on the training field, I will say ready, and then we start training the routine. I want the dog to understand that whenever I say ready, it is time to give me 100% focus, 100% reliability, and 100% obedience. With working dogs, if I'm a police canine officer and I'm about to do a search, I want to say ready, and I want that dog to understand that it is now time to go search. It is now time to go to work. Same thing with hunting dogs. On the flip side of that, I use the free marker. My free marker is a complete total release cue. A lot of trainers will use free during their training session. They'll say sit, the dog sits, they'll say free, and they release the dog. I like to reserve free for the very end of the training session. Because I use yes as a release marker for the reward and for that command, free means you're now released from giving me 100%. You're now allowed to be free and be a dog and play crazy like. So let's look at IPO shuts and say if I'm about to do a BH routine. Before I get on the field, I say ready. The dog snaps into heel and looks at me in a focused heel. We march onto the field, we get ready, we check in with the judge, we do the full routine, we come back, I put the dog in a down, I receive my judge's critique, I put the dog back into a heel, we march off the field, and then I give it a free command. Through repetition and consistency, the dog learns that it must give me 100% until it hears that free command, and once the free has been said, it is now no longer held accountable, it is now able to run free, run amok, and have a good time. So that's our 6 markers of training. We have yes, nuh-uh, good, no, ready, and free. Write these down and get ready to use these, because in the future videos we're going to be having, you're going to see our pre-learning phase, how we load the marks, how we start the learning phase, how we start luring, how we start incorporating hand signals, how we start making the dog work for duration, how we make the dog work under distractions, and then how we condition the dog to verbal marks. verbal cues. So keep that in mind, write this down in your book, and get ready to study those, because we're going to continue, and now this is where we really start our training series.